What happens when one of the world's most beloved wildlife conservationists sits down for what should be a simple morning interview, only to have it spiral into one of the most uncomfortable moments in live television history? Robert Irwin, the son of the legendary Steve Irwin, walked off the set of The Today Show after an exchange with Savannah Guthrie that left the studio in stunned silence. The tension was palpable, the questions were relentless, and what started as a friendly conversation about his new wildlife documentary quickly became something neither the producers nor the audience expected. Before we dive into exactly what was said and how it all unraveled, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling us what you think really happened here. Because this story has layers that go way beyond what the cameras caught. The morning started like any other at the Today Show studios in New York City. Robert Irwin arrived early, dressed casually in his signature khaki shirt, a nod to his father's iconic look. He was there to promote his latest project, a documentary series focusing on endangered species in Southeast Asia. The producers had briefed Savannah Guthrie on the talking points, standard stuff about conservation efforts, behind-the-scenes stories from filming, maybe a few anecdotes about growing up at Australia Zoo. Everything seemed straightforward. Robert had done hundreds of interviews before, always charming, always articulate, always passionate about wildlife. He was a natural on camera, having essentially grown up in front of one. The crew buzzed around, making final adjustments to lighting and sound. Savannah reviewed her notes one last time, sipping her coffee, chatting casually with the producers about the segment. Nobody had any reason to think this would be anything other than another pleasant morning interview. The cameras went live at 8:37. Savannah opened with her trademark warm smile, welcoming Robert to the show. He smiled back, settling into the chair across from her, relaxed and ready. The first few minutes went exactly as planned. Savannah asked about the documentary, and Robert lit up talking about the footage they had captured of Sumatran tigers, one of the rarest big cats on the planet. He described the months spent in the jungle, the challenges of filming wildlife in their natural habitat, the moments that took his breath away. His passion was infectious, and you could see Savannah nodding along, genuinely interested. He talked about a particular scene where they had tracked a mother tiger and her cubs for weeks, finally capturing footage of them playing near a waterfall. It was the kind of heartwarming content that morning shows thrive on, feel-good stories with stunning visuals. Then Savannah shifted gears. She leaned forward slightly, her expression changing from casual interest to something more serious, more probing. She said, "Robert, I want to ask you something that I think a lot of people wonder about. You have spent your entire life in the spotlight, following in your father's footsteps. Do you ever feel like you are living in his shadow, like you are trying to be him rather than finding your own path?" The question hung in the air for a moment. Robert's smile faded slightly, not disappearing entirely, but definitely cooling. He paused, and you could see him choosing his words carefully. He said, "I think that's a natural question people have, but I have never felt like I was trying to be my dad. I am trying to continue his work, his mission, but in my own way. Conservation does not belong to one person. It belongs to all of us." Savannah nodded, but she did not move on. She pressed further. "But you have to admit there is pressure, right? Every time you appear on screen, people are comparing you to Steve Irwin. They are looking for that same energy, that same fearlessness. Does that ever feel like a burden?" Robert shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening just slightly. He said, "I think what people do not understand is that my dad was not a character. He was himself, and I am myself. Yes, we share the same passion, the same love for animals, but I am not trying to recreate him. I am trying to honor him by doing work that matters." Savannah tilted her head, her tone remaining friendly, but her questions growing sharper. She said, "But is not part of the appeal, for lack of a better word, the fact that you are Steve Irwin's son? Would you have the same platform, the same opportunities, if you were just another wildlife enthusiast?" The studio seemed to go quieter. Robert's expression shifted noticeably now. He was no longer smiling. He said, "I think that is a pretty reductive way to look at it. Yes, being my father's son opened doors, I am not going to deny that, but I have spent my entire life working to prove that I deserve to walk through those doors. I have dedicated myself to this cause, and I think the work speaks for itself." Savannah leaned back slightly, as if giving him space, but her questions kept coming. She said, "I am not trying to diminish what you have done, Robert. I am just trying to understand the dynamic. Because from an outside perspective, it can look like you are riding on his legacy rather than building your own. Robert's eyes narrowed. He said, "Riding on his legacy? Savannah, I was there when he died. I was 14 years old. I watched my family grieve. I watched my mother hold everything together. I watched my sister struggle with growing up without a father. And through all of that, we made a choice to keep his mission alive because it mattered, because the animals matter. So no, I am not riding on anything. I am carrying it forward." The tension was undeniable now. Savannah's co-hosts, sitting off to the side, exchanged glances. One of the producers in the control room could be heard through the earpieces telling Savannah to ease up, to move to the next topic, but she did not. She said, "I hear you, and I respect that. But let me ask you this, because I think it is something a lot of young people deal with. How do you separate your own identity from the legacy you have inherited? How do you know where Steve Irwin ends and Robert Irwin begins?" Robert stared at her for a long moment, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair. He said, "You know what, Savannah? I came here to talk about conservation. I came here to talk about a documentary that took 2 years to make, that highlights species on the brink of extinction, that hopefully inspires people to care about the natural world. But instead, you want to psychoanalyze me, dissect my relationship with my father, question whether I have earned my place. I do not think that is what this interview was supposed to be about." Savannah raised her hand slightly, a gesture meant to be calming. She said, "I am not trying to attack you, Robert. These are questions that come up, questions that people are curious about." Robert shook his head. He said, "No, these are questions you decided to ask because you think it makes for good television. You think digging into my personal life, my grief, my identity, is more interesting than talking about the work. And maybe you are right. Maybe people do find that more interesting. But I am not here for that. I am here to make a difference." Savannah's smile was gone now too. She said, "I think you are being a little unfair. This is a conversation, not an interrogation." Robert let out a short, humorless laugh. He said, "A conversation? Savannah, you just questioned whether I have earned anything I have done. You just implied that everything I have achieved is because of my last name. That does not feel like a conversation. That feels like an attack." The studio was dead silent, except for the hum of equipment. Savannah tried to recover. She said, "That was not my intention, and if it came across that way, I apologize. But I do think these are valid topics to explore." Robert stood up abruptly, unclipping his microphone. He said, "Maybe they are, but not with me, not today. I came here in good faith, and this is not what I signed up for." The cameras were still rolling, capturing every second of the exchange. Savannah looked genuinely taken aback now, her professional composure cracking slightly. She said, "Robert, please, let's just take a breath and refocus. We still have time. We can talk about the documentary, about the animals, whatever you want." Robert shook his head again, more firmly this time. He said, "I appreciate that, but I think I am done here." He dropped the microphone on the chair and started walking toward the exit. Savannah called after him, "Robert, come on, this is live television. We can work this out." But he did not stop. He kept walking, his stride purposeful, his expression set. The cameras followed him for a few seconds before one of the producers signaled to cut to commercial. But the damage was done. The moment was out there, broadcast live to millions of viewers. As Robert disappeared through the studio doors, Savannah sat there, clearly rattled, trying to regain her composure. She turned to the camera and said, "We will be right back," her voice steady but her eyes showing the strain. The control room erupted into chaos, producers scrambling to figure out what to do next, how to salvage the segment, how to address what had just happened. But Robert was already gone, his publicist rushing after him, trying to catch up as he stormed through the hallways of the Today Show building. The commercial break felt like it lasted forever for everyone behind the scenes, but for Savannah Guthrie sitting at that desk, it probably felt like seconds. When the cameras came back on, she had clearly been coached during the break. Her expression was carefully neutral, professional, but there was something in her eyes that suggested she knew this had gone sideways in a way that could not be easily fixed. She addressed the audience directly, saying, "We apologize for that abrupt ending to our segment with Robert Irwin. Clearly, there were some miscommunications about the direction of our conversation, and we hope to have him back soon to discuss his important conservation work." Her co-host jumped in to help smooth things over, pivoting quickly to the next segment, but social media was already exploding. Clips of the exchange were being uploaded, dissected, shared thousands of times within minutes. The hashtag about Robert walking off started trending almost immediately, and people had very strong opinions about what they had just witnessed. But what nobody watching at home knew was what happened in those moments right after Robert left the studio. According to people who were there, Robert did not just walk to his dressing room and cool off. He went straight to the building's lobby, his publicist practically jogging to keep up with him, trying to get him to stop, to wait, to think about the optics of leaving the building entirely. She kept saying, "Robert, just give it a minute. Let's talk this through. We can put out a statement." But Robert was not interested in statements or damage control. He pushed through the glass doors out onto Rockefeller Plaza, where fans who had been waiting outside for glimpses of the show's guests immediately recognized him. A few people called out his name, asked for photos, but he politely declined, his jaw still tight, his movements quick. His publicist finally caught up to him on the sidewalk, and they had what witnesses described as an intense but quiet conversation, her gesturing back toward the building, him shaking his head firmly. Meanwhile, back inside the studio, the producers were having their own crisis meeting during every commercial break. Savannah was defending her line of questioning, saying she had not intended to upset him, that she thought these were fair topics given how much of his identity is tied to his father's legacy. One producer reportedly told her that, fair or not, they had just lost control of a live segment in spectacular fashion, and now they needed to figure out how to handle the fallout. Another producer suggested they address it more directly when they came back from break, maybe have Savannah explain her perspective, but the executive producer shut that down immediately. The decision was made to move on, to treat it as a momentary disruption rather than dwelling on it, hoping it would blow over quickly. That decision would prove to be a miscalculation because the story was not going away, it was just getting started. What made the situation even more complicated was what people started noticing when they rewatched the footage. Body language experts began analyzing every gesture, every facial expression, every shift in posture. They pointed out how Robert's demeanor changed the moment Savannah asked that first pointed question about living in his father's shadow. They noted how his hands went from relaxed and gesturing naturally while talking about wildlife to gripping the armrests, a classic defensive posture. They observed how Savannah's own body language shifted, leaning forward aggressively when asking the tougher questions, a technique often used in investigative journalism but wildly out of place in what was supposed to be a promotional interview for a documentary. Media critics started weighing in too, with some defending Savannah's approach as legitimate journalism, asking hard questions rather than serving up softball promotional content. Others accused her of ambushing a guest, of using a conservation segment as a Trojan horse for a much more personal and invasive line of questioning. The debate raged across platforms, but what got lost in all the hot takes and analysis was the actual content of what Robert had been there to discuss. The documentary he had poured 2 years of his life into, the endangered species that desperately needed attention, the conservation message that had motivated him to do the interview in the first place, all of it was overshadowed by the drama of the walk-off, and that, according to people close to Robert, was what bothered him most. Not the uncomfortable questions, not even the public nature of the conflict, but the fact that, once again, the story had become about him personally rather than the cause he was trying to serve. This was apparently a recurring frustration for him, the sense that media outlets were more interested in the Irwin family drama, the tragic loss of Steve, the pressure on Robert to live up to an impossible standard, than they were in actually covering conservation issues. But here's where the story takes another turn, because about 40 minutes after Robert left the building, still during the live broadcast of the Today Show, his phone started blowing up. Not with calls from his publicist or his team, but with messages from other conservationists, other wildlife advocates, people he had worked with over the years. They were sending him screenshots, articles, messages of support, but also warnings. The narrative was already being shaped, and not in his favor. Some outlets were framing him as thin-skinned, unable to handle tough questions, a celebrity who expected nothing but praise. Opinion pieces were already being drafted about entitled young stars who cannot deal with real journalism. His publicist was getting calls from other media outlets wanting his response, wanting to book him for follow-up interviews where he could explain himself, defend himself, essentially extend the story for days or weeks. This was the media cycle at its most aggressive, and Robert was at the center of it. He made a decision in that moment that surprised everyone around him. Instead of issuing a carefully worded statement through his publicist, instead of doing another interview to clarify his position, he posted a video directly to his social media. It was shot on his phone, clearly impromptu, with him sitting in what looked like a park, probably somewhere in Manhattan, where he had gone to clear his head. He looked directly into the camera and said, "I want to address what happened this morning on the Today Show because I think it's important to be clear about why I walked away from that interview. I did not walk away because I cannot handle difficult questions. I have dealt with scrutiny my entire life, and I understand that comes with being in the public eye. I walked away because I realized that interview was never about conservation. It was never about the animals. It was about dissecting my personal life and my relationship with my father for entertainment value. And I am not willing to do that anymore." He continued, his voice steady but emotional in a way that felt genuine rather than performed. He said, "My father gave his life to wildlife conservation, literally, and the worst part of losing him was not just the personal grief, it was watching how his death became a spectacle, how his final moments were discussed and analyzed and debated by people who never knew him. I have spent the last 15 years trying to honor his legacy by doing meaningful work, not by performing grief or trauma for cameras. So when I sit down for an interview about a documentary that highlights species facing extinction, and instead get asked repeatedly whether I have earned my achievements or whether I am just riding my father's coattails, that is not journalism, that is exploitation. And I am done participating in it." The video was raw, unpolished, and it struck a chord immediately. Within an hour, it had millions of views, and the narrative began to shift. Suddenly, people were going back and watching the interview with fresh eyes, and what they saw looked different. Savannah's questions, which some had defended as appropriately challenging, now seemed needlessly personal and pointed. Her persistence when Robert tried to redirect the conversation looked less like good journalism and more like someone determined to create a moment, regardless of the guest's comfort. Comment sections filled with people sharing their own experiences of being asked invasive questions about dead parents, about living up to family legacies, about whether they had earned their success. The conversation expanded beyond just this one interview to broader questions about how media treats people dealing with public grief, how morning shows balance entertainment with information, and whether there are lines that should not be crossed even in the name of compelling television. The Today Show's social media accounts were flooded with responses, many of them critical, many demanding an apology to Robert, many questioning Savannah's approach. Inside 30 Rock, the executives were now facing a full-blown public relations crisis. The initial strategy of moving past it quickly had backfired spectacularly. Robert's video had reframed the entire incident, and now they were on the defensive. A meeting was called with the show's key stakeholders, including Savannah, the producers, and network executives. According to sources familiar with the meeting, it was tense. Savannah maintained that her questions were fair and that Robert overreacted, while some producers argued that regardless of intent, the optics were terrible and they needed to address it more directly. The discussion went in circles for over an hour, with no clear consensus on how to respond. Some wanted to issue a statement supporting Savannah and her journalistic integrity. Others wanted to apologize to Robert and try to smooth things over. And still others wanted to say nothing at all and wait for the next news cycle to push the story out of the spotlight. While they debated, Robert's video continued to spread. Other celebrities started weighing in, many of them sharing their own experiences with interviews that went off the rails, with questions that crossed boundaries, with feeling ambushed by hosts they had trusted. Several prominent conservationists posted their support for Robert, praising him for prioritizing the message over the platform, for walking away from a situation that was not serving the cause. Wildlife organizations began sharing clips from his documentary, using the controversy as an opportunity to redirect attention to the actual conservation issues he had been trying to highlight. In a strange way, Robert's walk-off was accomplishing what the original interview had failed to do. It was getting people talking about endangered species, about habitat loss, about the urgent need for conservation action. But it was happening in spite of the Today Show, not because of it. Then, about 3 hours after the incident, Savannah posted her own response on social media. It was more formal than Robert's video, clearly drafted with input from publicists and lawyers, but it attempted to strike a conciliatory tone. She wrote that she had tremendous respect for Robert and his work, that her questions came from a place of genuine curiosity rather than any desire to cause pain, and that she regretted that the interview ended the way it did. She stopped short of a full apology, instead framing it as a mutual misunderstanding, a clash of expectations, rather than anyone being in the wrong. The response was carefully calibrated to protect her credibility as a journalist, while also acknowledging that the segment had not gone as planned. But for many people watching this unfold, the statement felt inadequate, a corporate response to a human moment, something designed by committee rather than coming from the heart. The social media response to Savannah's statement was swift and largely negative. People compared her polished, careful words to Robert's raw, emotional video and found hers lacking in authenticity. Comments flooded in saying she had missed the point entirely, that this was not about a misunderstanding but about a fundamental disrespect for boundaries. Others pointed out that her statement never actually addressed the specific questions she had asked, never acknowledged that maybe, just maybe, asking someone repeatedly if they had earned their success while sitting across from them on live television was inappropriate, regardless of intent. The gap between her measured corporate response and Robert's vulnerable honesty made the contrast even starker, and public opinion was clearly swinging in his direction. But the real turning point came when footage emerged that nobody knew existed. A production assistant who had been in the green room before the interview posted a short clip on their personal account, apparently not realizing the implications. The video showed Savannah and her producer having a conversation before Robert arrived. The audio was muffled, but clear enough to make out Savannah saying something about needing to make the segment more interesting than just another wildlife promotion, that they needed an angle, something that would get people talking. The producer could be heard agreeing, mentioning that the father angle always generated engagement. The production assistant deleted the video within minutes of posting it, but it had already been screen recorded and shared hundreds of times. That brief clip confirmed what many had suspected, that the line of questioning was not spontaneous or organic, it was premeditated, a deliberate strategy to create a moment. The fallout was immediate and severe. The Today Show's ratings took a hit as viewers expressed their disappointment, many saying they had lost trust in the show's approach to interviews. Sponsors began quietly expressing concerns about being associated with what was increasingly being framed as exploitative journalism. Inside NBC, discussions intensified about whether Savannah should address the situation again, this time with a genuine apology, or whether that would only keep the story alive longer. Savannah herself was reportedly devastated by how the situation had escalated, insisting to colleagues that she never intended to hurt Robert, that she was just doing her job as a journalist. But intent and impact are different things, and the impact was undeniable. Robert, meanwhile, had gone quiet after his initial video. He did not post again, did not give any additional interviews, did not engage with the ongoing debate. People close to him said he was focused on the documentary, on making sure that despite everything, the conservation message got through. In a way, his silence was more powerful than anything else he could have said. It let his initial statement stand on its own, let people draw their own conclusions about what had happened, and kept him from becoming part of the endless back and forth that was consuming everyone else involved. Several media ethics professors began using the incident as a teaching moment, discussing with their students where the line is between asking challenging questions and ambushing a guest, between holding public figures accountable and exploiting their trauma for ratings. About a week after the incident, something unexpected happened. The Today Show invited a panel of media critics and ethicists to discuss the interview on air, an unusually transparent move that suggested someone in management had decided the only way through this was radical honesty. Savannah was part of the discussion, sitting somewhat uncomfortably as experts dissected her approach. One panelist said that while asking about family legacy was not inherently wrong, the way the questions were framed, the persistence despite visible discomfort, and the apparent premeditation all combined to create something that felt more like gotcha journalism than meaningful conversation. Another panelist defended her, arguing that public figures need to be able to handle tough questions and that Robert's walk-off, while understandable emotionally, set a concerning precedent about guests controlling narratives. The segment was fascinating television, messy and uncomfortable, and real in a way morning shows rarely are. At the end of the discussion, Savannah did something she had not done in her written statement. She looked directly into the camera and said, "I want to speak directly to Robert if he is watching. I am sorry. I am sorry that an interview meant to highlight your important work became about something else entirely. I am sorry that my questions, whatever their intent, caused you pain. And I am sorry that I did not recognize in the moment that we had gone off course in a way that was not serving you or the audience or the animals you care so deeply about. I hope you will give us another chance someday, but I understand if you do not." It was not a perfect apology, but it felt genuine in a way her statement had not, and it marked a rare moment of real accountability on live television. Robert never responded publicly to the apology. His documentary premiered 2 weeks later and received critical acclaim and strong viewership numbers, boosted in part by all the attention the Today Show incident had generated. In interviews promoting the documentary with other outlets, he was gracious when asked about what happened, saying simply that he had moved on and hoped everyone could focus on the conservation work instead. The incident became a case study in media ethics courses, a cautionary tale about the difference between challenging journalism and exploitative questioning, and a reminder that behind every public figure is a human being with boundaries that deserve respect. The Today Show implemented new guidelines for interviewing guests who had experienced public tragedy, and Savannah Guthrie became noticeably more cautious in her approach to personal questions in subsequent interviews. In the end, what happened between Robert Irwin and Savannah Guthrie that morning was not really about either of them as individuals. It was about the tension between entertainment and journalism, between the public's curiosity and a person's right to privacy, between honoring someone's legacy and allowing their family to grieve and grow beyond it. It was a moment that forced uncomfortable conversations about how media operates, what audiences demand, and what lines should never be crossed, regardless of ratings or engagement. Both of them, in different ways, handled an impossible situation with more grace than they probably felt in the moment, and both of them taught everyone watching something valuable about respect, boundaries, and the human cost of compelling television. If you found this story as fascinating as we did, make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below answering this question. Do you think journalists should ask difficult personal questions, even if they make guests uncomfortable? Or are there some topics that should be off limits no matter what? Let us know what you think.